get screwed by that. Shrewsbury's a loser.
It's recording.
In the long run?
Yeah, every year.
Now, according to Rob, he presented that to them last year, what it would look like.
So if you want to stop one more time, this is
Okay. And what it would look like.
This agenda's here for. We'll talk about it.
Okay. Nothing's worse than having your chin on the table.
Actually, we have a
yeah, and then you can just kind of do it like that.
forum, so I think we only have to wait a couple of minutes for Anurag is free, but Raj, you shouldn't be teaching yet.
I don't know.
And
No, I'm going to wait till the actual session. We'll start that one. How's the audience on?
oh, did he? Yeah. We'll give it a couple more minutes. While I'm doing
What about
that,
Bob? So, is he?
yeah, he's the other one we're waiting. Just give a few minutes to. I forgot at the last meeting to bring these. This is the 2012 edition of the Finance Committee handbook that I got at the allotment that I got at the annual meeting. And there are some changes to the book this year, and I was thinking that Sandy, if you wanted to make copies of it, then we would need to hold it back and you could give a copy to somebody else later. Because I have just enough for the committee.
He can use mine. I have the big book and I have the last year's upgrade, and I'm not
Well-
gonna run home and read it right away.
So whatever you guys want to do.
So Sandy, if you'd like
I
to take
took
it
one
and make
out
a copy.
already.
Okay.
And then when I see you, which will be a long time from now.
Yeah, I mean, all of the other documents on there are pretty much the same as they have been for every year, and the book is pretty much the same. There are little things that they changed, like the section that has to do with the calculation of Chapter 70 formula. They updated with new figures and stuff like that. But it's not substantially changed. Nobody went through and rewrote the book.
This next week.
And, okay, well,
Quiz next week.
I think we can go ahead whenever ACTV is ready then and call a meeting to order.
So we're ready to go.
Okay, call a meeting of the Finance Committee for January 17, 2013 to order. It's 2 minutes after 7. Thank everybody for being here promptly. And I want to thank John for being with us today, and thank ACTV and for being here, and for everybody who's able to watch at home, the Amherst media, for your interest. We will be talking about the town manager's budget. Principally, there will be other items. The town manager's budget is available if you're watching at home by going onto the town website under the budget section. It's available on the front page, and so that what we're referring to as we talk is available there. First agenda item I did want to touch on and then just go straight into the budget so that John's here for the first two pieces, and then he can make his choices at that point. That news affecting budget, anything that you have learned, Sandy or John, and particularly what I put in there, of course, was that the governor made proposals about changes that he would like to make to both the pension and the OPEB laws in 2 statements last week. And if you have any information that you can have to offer, any projections about what that might mean for the town.
Sure. I'm going to hand out a summary of the healthcare changes that were recommended by the so-called OPEB Commission, which was made up of representatives of labor, the MMA, various members of the state administration, and some outside experts. And I think probably the easiest thing to do is flip to the second page. So there's a proposal out that would, that came out of this commission that the governor has basically filed this legislation that would change the way people get their health insurance. Currently, you are entitled to health insurance once you are entitled to a pension. So, and that pension vesting period is 10 years. And then once you get that health insurance, then depending on what city or town you're in or whether you're working for the state, there are different percentages that might be covered. But, you know, so for example, if you're in Amherst and you work for 10 years and then you retire, you get health insurance. So let's say you start as a 55-year-old and work for 10 years and work until you're 65, you would get health insurance at either 75 or 80%. So the gist of what this does, it says that you have to have at least 20 years of service in order to be eligible for health insurance. And then at that point, you would get health insurance at 50%, and that it would go up over time the longer you worked until you were at 30 years, in which case you would get the full benefit of whatever your city or town offers, or the state offers. So it's trying to put in place a connection between length of service and length of benefit. So this is a proposal in order to get the support of all of the players. They made some compromises, including saying that it would only apply prospectively. So if you were a current employee and you were within 5 years of whatever your retirement age group is, and there are different age groups for whether you're a public safety employee or a non-public safety employee. Basically, they hold people harmless for getting their retirement. And they also said that current contribution levels are frozen for the next 3 years. Municipalities cannot negotiate or impose changes on the contribution level for the retirees over the next 3 years. That has proven controversial with the MMA. The MMA representative voted against this compromise because of that provision. But it seemed like it was fairly key for labor to agree to these provisions. So there's going to be some politics going on that issue. The effect of this is really in the long term. There's no short-term savings for us in this area. It is estimated that over 30 years, this will save between $15 and $20 billion across the Commonwealth. I wouldn't start spending that yet. And I think what really we would see in the long run is that this would contain the cost of health insurance to some extent, because you won't be paying the full freight for people who are more or less short-term participants in the state or local systems. But we don't have an estimate from how this would affect individual cities and towns. That information has not come out. And this is still a proposal, so there's a lot of tweaking that may or may not happen. So it may look like this or it may change. I think there is general consensus on the idea, though, that there should be a link between the benefit you receive and your length of service, and I think that's what's fundamental to this, and that's what we'll see coming out of any reform that passes. questions on that?
So we are right now awaiting a actuarial study, new round.
Yes,
And the actuarial study will be done based upon current law.
correct.
So it would be until the next round of study before the legislature will have likely done anything, and it can be incorporated into anything that we have that's
Exactly
True,
right, so
accurate.
it'll be 2 years from now when we do our next OPEB study, and by that time, if this law or something like it passes, it will be reflected in the numbers that the actuaries produce at that point.
other questions. Doug?
And you may or may not know the answer to this, and so I'm curious at the notion of 20 years of service to acquire the option, just because of the mobility of workers. I find that an interesting number.
So
And
once-
what was the thinking with regard to that? Because I think there's a lot of people that will work 7 or 8 jobs over the course of their career, and they may never work anywhere for 20 years.
So you don't have to work one place for 20 years, you just have to work for a subdivision of the Commonwealth.
Oh, I see.
So you could go from town to town, or
Right.
from town to the state. What we don't have is portability between that and the private sector, but it's
Right.
all public sector jobs.
Right. Okay.
Okay,
But then who pays the final benefit? Who's the final payee? The last job, the last employer?
That's an interesting question. For years, that was the case. It was the last employer. A couple of years ago, the law was changed to say that you would apportion the cost among the previous employers. Just the same way that we do with pensions. Your pension costs are apportioned according to your employers and the years of service you had with each one. So, for example, if I were to retire, well, actually, John is a good example. He's going to retire from the town of Amherst at some point. The Hampshire County Retirement Board would send a bill to New Bedford for some of his time, to Lennox for some of his time, and to Northampton for some of his time, and to the state, the Department of Revenue for some of his time, because he worked for all of those entities, and they were all either part of the state pension system or there's political subdivisions which count as. So the idea is that the same thing is supposed to happen with health insurance. It's very complicated. It's much more complicated with health insurance because there are different levels of benefits between different cities and towns. And we, I think we got our first bill, and I think it was from Northampton for somebody who retired from there, but had worked in Amherst, and so we did some, I think with maybe the regional school department. So theoretically, it could happen that those people's payments are apportioned out among their various employers. In practice, that sometimes happens and sometimes doesn't.
yeah, Bob?
Is there any place where John didn't work?
We won't go there, Mary Lynn.
Is there any consideration being given to also adding in how much one makes when they retire, their retirement benefit in terms of dollars? I see that someone who's maybe worked in a lower paying job in the state or municipality, even after 20 years, wouldn't get a very big pension. I think it's been the top 3, or maybe now it's going to be the top 5.
It has, a year ago it changed, that law was in effect, and it's now gonna be the top 5.
Okay, but still, that compared to, for instance, community college presidents who obviously make a nice salary because of their position,
Right.
but when they retire and they've been in the system a long time, they can retire at a fairly large salary. That compared to someone at the lower end is troubling to me. So is there any thought of adding, in addition to this, some dividers? People who get over 100,000 in retirement would pay 50%, even though they've been here 33 years, that
Well,
sort of thing.
this is a summary of what passed last year for the pension reform. This is produced by the MMA. And what happened with pension reform in 2011 is they increased the age for retirement, minimum age from 55 to 60, and in order to collect a full pension, it went from 65 to 67. They used the top 5 instead of the top 3. They got rid of some things where elected officials were counting their time as elected officials to boost their pension, because your pension is a function of how much you earn and how long you've earned it. So your years of service and your age. And they put in provisions that prevented you from getting a big boost in salary at the very end in order to boost your your pension.
Mm-hmm.
I call that the William Bulger reform. Now there are a few other things that are some minor things. There was discussion, and frankly, Mary Lou, I don't know if it was incorporated. There was some discussion about capping the maximum pension you could receive, and I have the feeling that that was part of it, but it's not on this sheet. So that you could basically earn a pension up to a certain amount of your earnings, but earnings above that wouldn't give you a bigger pension. And frankly, I don't know if that was part of it. It was certainly a big part of the discussion at the time that this was being debated, and I just don't remember if it went through.
Well, it's the healthcare costs that hurt some of the people on the lower end of retirement benefits.
Well, and in fact, I think it is important to keep in mind that I think the average pension, I forget what the Hampshire County number is now, but it's probably under $20,000.
It is.
And part of that is because some of the pensioners are surviving spouses. So there are women who've long outlived their husbands and are still getting their husband's pension and getting it. And when you get your spouse gets your pension, you get it as a fraction of that.
Correct.
And so there are some people who basically their pension is covering their health insurance at this point, and not much else.
Right.
You know, you've raised an interesting question. I think that it probably is a matter for the legislature, however, to work out. It's not anything, obviously, that we're going to work out in this committee, but the question is to the fairness of having the same premium applied regardless of the pension. And it's not something I see in the legislation. I guess the last policy question for the town, which is where we need to bring this back to, is that it seems from what I'm gathering that there isn't going to be a short-term change, and that it's not really going to reduce the amount of our obligation, as will be shown in the next actuarial study, and it really is a question of the effect of this would be to slow the future growth in those actuarial amounts, so that since we know that we already have a pretty wide gap and it's not going to shrink, that it should not change the committee's thinking and recommendations regarding OPEB contributions.
I would agree with that.
Yes.
And then one last question. With the amount of money that the state has to put into OPEB, its accounts, how do you see that affecting their contributions to, or their monies back to cities and towns and schools? It did say 20 billion in that article.
But that's what they're looking at savings by enacting these reforms.
So these reforms would take care of that amount that they haven't paid in. And it should not affect what cities and towns get back from the state.
No, I don't think I think that the whole question as to what cities and towns get from the state is much more tied to other discussions like what the adequate level of funding education is. There's been some talk about the need perhaps for the state to help cities and towns subsidize their OPEB obligations because they're so huge. But that did not come out of this commission. That was something that had been talked about as a topic for the commission to consider. They did not recommend that, and so instead what they're doing is recommending some long-term solutions to constrain cost increases and costs for cities and towns with their OPEB obligations.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else on this topic? Nothing else nice? And last question then, was there something last week that I heard that he also put in a recommendation about pension reform, additional pension reform in addition, or was that, did I not hear that correctly?
I don't recall any, I mean, I think he's made a big point of saying that they've done incrementally taken bites at pension and now health and, you know, they did a big reform with health insurance. There may be some tweaking, but there's nothing major.
Okay. So anything else? If not, then we'll go to the follow-up discussion in town manager's budget that we received yesterday and questions that people have. What my thought is a suggestion, but if you don't like it, say so, that we go through the areas sort of sequentially and see if there are questions about particular sections rather than jumping all over the board, and try and order it a little bit that way. And does that seem okay? So the first section is just presumptions made about revenues and that are going into the budget, and I didn't detect that there was any changes from what you presented in October.
No, really the only changes were that we did update the retirement assessment number from October. That is different than what the October sheet said, because we got our assessment numbers from Hampshire County. We changed that for FY14, and also I made a change for FY15 based on what they told us about what they think their trends are. So those in both cases went up a little bit. When we got our final PVTA assessment, that also changed, which affected what we are going to be hit with on the cherry sheet for PVTA assessment and how much the transportation fund was having to pay. So there's some tweaks like that, but other than that, I think the big ones to keep in mind are state aid numbers the same as we had back in October, you know, that we still did not rely on any reserves or anything like that. And I think the property tax number is $4,000 higher than it was in October, because we finally got our new growth number certified, so we have a real number instead of an estimate.
When you say there was not a significant change, there was a small change in retirement, can you give us a ballpark so we know what that means?
Oh, yeah, I think in October,
What page, please?
this is the last white page, right before the green pages.
Okay, thank you.
So it's page Roman numeral XXVI 26. So the retirement assessment had been, and I think a 7.5% increase in October. It's now a 13.2% increase, which is I forget exactly what the number was. It was $200,000, almost $300,000 back then, and it's gone up to $457,000 increase from FY13. So that went up. Our PVTA assessment went down, and in order to keep the budget balanced, we tweaked a couple of other things just to keep things in balance, so we could meet the retirement assessment. that's no significant change.
Because the PVTA is charged off to the transportation fund, isn't it?
Yes, but the transportation fund then becomes a revenue source in the general fund. And that amount, went down because the overall PVT assessment went down. That's why you see a decrease of $99,000 in, special assessments in FY14.
Okay,
Where, and didn't search long enough to find it, where would the decrease because of the end of reimbursements to the town from the elementary school for retired teachers' health insurance, where would that show up?
Oh, that shows up in miscellaneous on page 1, on the first page here. There's a decrease in this number of $61,000
First page of what?
of this spreadsheet. So page
that's
25.
XD.
It's XD.
Oh, okay. Excellent. Shows under miscellaneous.
So the last row of local receipts.
Oh, right.
Um,
Oh, where it says no teachers GIC, that's the
Yes.
note, okay.
Also, so that decrease, there's a decrease there in what the school is reimbursing us, and then if you look on the next page, under state assessments, so for unincorporated uses, there is a decrease of $134,000, which represents, there were a number of different number of changes in the cherry sheets, but the principal one was that we were no longer being assessed by the state GIC for those retired teachers, and so that assessment, that cost went down.
Anything else? Otherwise, we'll turn to the yes, Jess.
I was looking at that, and under local receipts, there's the pilot listed,
Mm-hmm.
and I was going across there, and I couldn't quite figure it out, and then as I was reading through, I guess there was a change in where the enterprise fund reimbursements show up, down at the other financing sources, down at the bottom, because across the line from pilot, it says something about enterprise funds reimbursement to general fund in the comments.
Yeah, the enterprise funds actually essentially make a tax payment, and they also make a payment to reimburse the general fund for the work that general fund people do for enterprise fund.
But that's not the
Activities.
pilot.
No, that's different from a pilot. A pilot is a payment in lieu of taxes. It's sort of equivalent of a tax payment. This is
But it's on the same line with the cost.
sorry, Janice, could you say that again?
Okay, so it says pilot in the left-hand column,
Yeah.
and then if you go all the way across to the end of that,
The note is about the
Line.
enterprise fund.
it says
Oh,
enterprise,
it
talks
says
about enterprise
reimbursement,
funds.
right.
So you just probably didn't move that down to where the enterprise funds are.
I see what you're saying. Yes, okay.
Right, on the pilot line, those are payments in lieu of taxes from the enterprise funds to the general funds, which is different than a reimbursement. And then down below on other financing, the enterprise fund reimbursements are enterprise fund reimbursements for the items that Cindy just mentioned. So there's payments to the general fund from the enterprise funds and reflected on both of those categories.
So that is supposed to be enterprise funds?
Yes.
So it's just enterprise funds, not payment
Enterprise funds
taxes and
payments to the
revenues.
general fund.
There are a number of smaller payments in there too, but the donation that Amherst College makes shows up on that line. And,
They're not UMass's.
no, well, UMass pays us differently. Mostly that goes into the ambulance fund, which then comes back into the general fund as a revenue source. The ambulance fund is one of the revenue sources that is, it's under, other financing sources near the bottom of page 25.
Anything to follow up or yes, or? Because otherwise then general government will be over to the expense side. But as we do this, if there's subjects in the add restore list that tie back to items here, we can do, don't hesitate to bring that up as we go through, or we could do it at the end by going to the add restore list after getting through the functional areas. But whatever way makes sense to you, as you're doing it because you're probably aware of what was on the add restore list, since it's always a prominent item of the presentation and was last night. Probably more questions about that than anything else, including for me. So are there any questions that anybody had right now? And of course we will, for the sake of everybody who's watching at home, because the committee is well aware of this, we will be coming back and meeting with staff from the various departments and getting more detailed presentations about services and plans that are proposed and budget effects on each of the functional areas. So we will be spending part of an evening as the process proceeds about the functional areas, but these are just sort of the initial questions that anyone might have.
I would just say one thing, it wasn't highlighted in the letter, and we'll get more detail when we get into it in specific departments, but I think one of the things that we really tried to do this year was to shore up the funding and make it closer to our actual experience in certain key areas. So, for example, our Medicare and our unemployment accounts had been underfunded over the last couple of years. Basically, they've been level funded, and so we really made an effort this year to fully fund, or at least get them a lot closer to what we think fully funding is going to be. Same thing for our insurance costs, our insurance policies, as those have gone up. There are certain accounts over the years have been just level funded, and so we tried to make them closer to what we think our real expenses are going to be. It's not something that's outside of the finance committee. What people are going to find out exciting, I would think, but I would think you people would appreciate it.
I think the two ad lists that are near the top that fall within this area, one we talked about yesterday, is whether there's going to have to be some rethinking about the elections budget because of the special election with Senator Kerry's seat likely coming open. And that there's nothing we can do about it. I don't know if we can assume revenue for the.
I would assume that the state will cover a substantial portion, as they do with the state election. They cover some of our costs, so when we're figuring, printing ballots and so forth, they do that for us. We will have some of our own costs, but they will usually throw some money in cities and towns for these special elections, but we just don't know when that's going to be yet.
They did that for the last special election for the Senate seat, didn't they?
Right. What would be needed though would be an appropriation for the gross amount, but we would have information when requesting an appropriation at town meeting of the likely reimbursement from the state. And we should be in a position to know that well before annual town meeting, given the timing of the expected recommendations from the regionalization study committee happening sometime in March. Should have a sense.
And once the governor declares the dates of the election, we'll know what fiscal year they fall in. If the primary, for example, falls in the current year, we'll have to deal with it as a current year additional expense. But it's an additional expense somewhere.
You never know until you know, and some of these confirmation processes down in Washington, but there is a confirmation hearing for Senator Kerry next Thursday. So, it's quite possible the Senate will act, even before the end of the month.
You might want to be able to show that they can actually do something. And the other one is the economic development director, and I guess I'm not trying to say anything more about that. If we got that much additional funding, then we really would need to talk about it. I don't know if you want to say anything more about it.
Just reinforcing one of the points I made about that last night. This is not a new concept, but having another talented, focused, professional person actively engaging current and prospective enterprises who want to invest or expand in Amherst. There's a cost of doing that, but there's also a long-term benefit in terms of tax-based growth, job creation, and reducing residential overall share of the tax burden. If we have a more significant commercial tax base, and can we take better advantage of being home to 3 colleges, including the flagship campus, are there opportunities for economic development, investments related to research and development, lab space, all kinds of things. So when you look at the prospective cost of having a economic development position, it is substantial. But I am actively exploring ways I might partner with others to secure funding for a healthy portion of that, so that town contribution would be a much more doable number in the grand scheme of things.
I had one additional thought that I want to see if anybody else has any questions about it, and that is that it would seem that we also need to be involving the planning department, because there needs to be a mechanism that leads to zoning being conducive to whatever economic development the director would facilitate. If they don't work together and get to an end result, it would not seem that it's going to ultimately be productive.
I agree with you absolutely. Having the position report directly to me, I think, is important, because I would be working very closely with our economic development specialist, and that person would be working in collaboration with the planning staff and others. Turn concepts into reality, workable reality.
Anything else on this, or under general government questions? Yes, Kay, go ahead.
There's the ghost employee in the Human Resources, Human Rights organizational chart.
Could you see the page, please?
Page 30. It says benefits and safety manager with a dotted line around that.
So I will first mention that, you have the old one.
Yeah.
For the first time, we have org charts for all the departments.
Oh, yes, which is good, which is great.
So, and, they're supposed to be user-friendly and helpful for the public to understand the function of departments. And so one of the ideas we had about how org charts would look is that if there are employees that are in departments that are paid for with general fund dollars, then they are in these solid black boxes. The benefits and safety manager is a position that is currently held by Case Loga.
Okay, all right.
She's paid for by the healthcare trust fund, and she also works with the workers' comp trust fund. So that's why it's in a dotted line.
Got it, okay. Thank you.
So then, questions about public safety. Public safety, I guess the other thing to note is just as obvious as the general, right back in general government, that is where you put the additional money for negotiated salaries or public safety is therefore based on current salaries, and as you explained it pretty well last night. If there are any questions?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, well, when the Chief Nelson and Chief Livingstone get here, then you can hammer down with the questions, and John will either be ignoring it or watching it at home. If there are any other thoughts on this topic, let's go back and just make sure that I don't lose the. Should probably put ad list in here. We do have a police officer. It's the fourth item in the ad list that is within this area, and further down. Should we ever have the luck of getting that far down on the list, there are other positions, but I think we explained them pretty well, and I think that we all understand and appreciate that public safety departments have been doing a lot of work and under a lot of stress, and that's well the need in town, and I think that it's good that it's on the list. Anything else? Because then we get into an area that I think is going to have filling the public safety is next. But I'm going to start public works. Sorry.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
just before we leave public safety, regional dispatch. Where are we in that arc of work? Any updates there?
Still struggling to complete arrangements with the other three towns. It's very much in process, but
I hadn't heard much, so I assumed that's what,
Right.
what the situation was. No news is no news.
Do we have the names of those towns, or is that, or you just still on the drawing board?
Village Element has it.
Andy,
Yeah.
just a quick question. John, yesterday you talked about beginning negotiations with police and fire union
Yeah.
on their contract. Is there a sequence that to those negotiations? Does it go fire and police and then, or is it, are they on different?
All of our
Cycles.
contracts expire on the same date, this coming June 30th. So the bargaining process has commenced with all four of our units. We've had some at the table discussions with three of the four units so far. So we've begun a very good faith process. It isn't sequential. Each cycle kind of takes on a dynamic, but we're off to a good start. And optimistic we'll conclude a very fair and equitable agreement before the expiration of the current contract.
Thanks.
So we have fire, police, public works, and
SEIU, which is from clerical to administrative assistants and dispatchers. There's library personnel. That's a more
everybody else.
disparate unit.
Oh, and then there's the laborers, the DPW laborers
DPW.
are, that's the fourth.
Right, so you have fire, police, and public works.
Fire, police, public works, and clerical are.
The SEIU is
Okay,
all of
the
that.
SEIU is the clerical,
And library.
okay, and everybody else.
Right.
Okay,
So I'm glad to see you finding a way to put more money back into the DPW budget for, hiring for the highway workers.
Yeah, we were able to identify energy savings from the LED streetlights primarily, and made a very conscious decision to reinvest all of those savings to address that structural budget issue that we have, where we're not able to use our, we need to allocate the time of one of our crews to projects, even during some peak periods on maintenance or potholes, where the highest and best use of their time might be something else. And so this gives our DPW greater flexibility to do that. We still have a ways to go, but this is a great step forward on addressing that issue.
yeah,
It's a minor question and it doesn't have to do with money, but are the LED lights bright white or are they the yellow? Do you know? I'm just curious because they're prettier.
I think there's one downtown, and
Yeah.
Yes, they are, there's some.
right out there. I
They're the
think.
nice bright white. So
Yeah.
the snow in the winter looks bright white and
Yeah,
sparkles.
the yellow comes from the high pressure sodium lights.
And those are going?
Yeah, those will be replaced.
Great, thank you.
And the caliber of LED light, don't ever ask me for the technical explanation, but the caliber and the aesthetic quality of the LED lights are much improved even in the last 3 or 4 years.
and of course, this will mean that some projects like what they did, the DPW did the Spring Street lot this last year, and that kind of a project is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Contracting out and bringing those crews back into doing other work.
Yep.
And on the subject of streets, I know it's not really an operating budget item, but I couldn't help but want to ask, and that is, we did not get the grant for Pine Street, is that my understanding? Or has we not heard yet?
We did not get awarded the MassWorks grant for the second time for Pine Street. We had applied for $2 million back in September, and we learned that was not funded. There is a $2 million earmark in the state transportation bond bill related to Pine Street improvements. It's a $4 million project between road, sidewalks, water and sewer upgrades along Pine Street. So that is not definite money, but it certainly signals the intent of the legislature that they consider Pine Street a worthy project for consideration for state, a special state bonding included as a project. I think the big attention we need to be focused on the next couple of months, and you've seen it playing out really very prominently publicly this week, is the governor's very bold but I think necessary proposals out there on transportation infrastructure and public transit investments. And there's an income tax increases being proposed and sales tax reductions. But with the reduced sales tax of I think 4.5% from 6.25%, it goes down. But then The entire sales tax is dedicated to public works related infrastructure investments in the school building authority projects. Embedded within that proposal is to include a 50% increase in the Chapter 90 grant program, which is the annual allocation we get for road work from the state. We currently receive around $800,000. This would be a 10-year commitment on the part of the state to go from $200 million statewide to $300 million. That translates into an additional $4 million to the town of Amherst over the next 10 years, if that was to be enacted, $400,000 additional a year. So that's huge. And we've talked about the Amherst road needs. We have a $16 million backlog, of which we've identified about $9 million as critically needed, meaning in the next 3 to 5 years max. So an additional $4 million on top of the $8 million we will get at the existing funding level helps us a lot. And to the extent that we can do those roads sooner rather than later, that will save taxpayers, we think, money in the long term on cost avoidance, as the roads are repaired when they're less bad and less costly to fix. The other big piece there is the governor's proposal on the state income tax, while doubling the personal exemption, that would generate monies for education, both K through 12, early childhood ed, as well as higher ed, including a substantial increase in state support up to 50% instead of about 42% now to the university budget. So those are bold proposals, and the legislature will begin their debate in earnest. And stay tuned. There also would be significant monies in there for public transportation, including the PDTA. And the Mass DOT, which authored this report on transportation, recognized that it isn't just about population when you're trying to figure out the share of the pie that's spread around. It's what are your service levels, what service enhancements are needed, and what's your ridership. And the PDTA is the second largest public transportation system in the state, and our allocations from the state to support that service and reduce the burden on communities and people paying fares is essential. And so the governor's proposal recognizes that. That's very, very important.
Glad you brought that up, because I was going to ask that question when we got to the end, and was you going to spend a couple of minutes on the enterprise funds, because that would actually be a transportation enterprise fund change, and
Yes.
presumably, do I assume that it would be, if it happened, a reduction in what Pioneer Valley would ask of us?
Too soon to tell. It certainly bodes well for long-term rate of growth and stability and possibly even expansion of service. Our annual assessments are capped presently through agreements we have with PDTA and the 5 colleges, where the overall local assessment does not go up more than 2.5%. And then it gets divvied up amongst the different communities depending on your service levels in those towns, but the overall assessment is capped. So, but the ability of PVTA to fund the service in the first place, have modern bus fleet and other systems that would be directly affected. Right now there's capital monies from the feds coming to the state, to the PVTA, that are used for direct operating costs instead of upgrading fleet, which was not the original intent, but it was out of necessity to avoid near-term service cuts.
Follow-up questions from anyone? On the other aspect that you described in the transportation bond bill that the governor's proposing, and the transportation changes, not just bond, but taxation changes, if the legislature enacted it, part of that would be for the year that we're adopting a budget for, 14, and I guess we would need to give some consideration, if it's looking likely, as to whether that should be going into operating or all into capital, and which is an initial policy question that we all ought to be talking about, and whether we should be making assumptions for town meeting or waiting to do that at a supplemental town meeting, since it probably won't be known with absolute certainty until town meeting is done.
I think, yeah, I mean, gotta be careful about what I predict. I mean, talking about taxes and revenues is never easy for any legislature to talk about. So it really remains to be seen how quickly they move on this stuff, and in what form and in what magnitude. The positive is that the governor, the Senate president, and the House Speaker are all publicly committing to, keep this as a priority item on the agenda in the legislature, beginning now. So it's going to be the main event, I think, in the legislature this winter and spring. So, it might be one of those years where they're in the middle of the fray while we're finalizing recommendations for town meeting, and it'll just be too soon probably to build in assumptions. But we'll just be cognizant of those, and whether it's come back in the fall town meeting or whatever, once we know more. I think that will kind of answer itself, I think, as we get into March, April.
Yeah, and it depends, I guess, on if you get additional Chapter 90 money, it needs to be spent within the year that it, so it'd have to be spent within 14, so that the faster we get to planning to actual spending it, the better. We've always asked town meeting to review and support or approve, whatever we want to call it,
Right.
that allocation, but it's actually not required as a matter of
That's right.
law.
We have a lot more active plans to invest in the roads than we do dollars. So we have a very well-developed working list of road needs that are in a good form from which to then create bid specs and things like that. So, there's a domino effect, depending on how much Chapter 90 we get. What does that mean for our capital planning, for how much local money we might borrow to supplement that, and when. So that will affect the JCPC discussion, I'm sure, as we learn more about that part of the plan.
The question to me with others to see. No, you mentioned High Street being high on the state's list.
Well, it's on a very long earmark list in the transportation bond bill, and that's no guarantee of the state funding it.
Right, I
They have
understand.
the authority to pay for it.
Do we have any other roads in Amherst that are in that list?
I don't believe so.
Just Pine and High. Did you say High Street?
No, Pine.
Just fine.
Pine Street.
Pine, okay.
Okay. Anything else we want to talk about with Public Works?
A question about what we use on the roads. On the news tonight, I guess truckers, companies are asking Connecticut to stop using the chemicals they use on their roads in the winter for snow, because it's corroding the trucks faster than normal. Is that the bag it uses? So it's salt and something else. But it was something that's come up and it's a request by trucking groups to, it may be a question for.
There have been some tweaks on the materials we use. I don't believe we're using what Connecticut uses, but we can alert Guilford to be ready to answer kind of the basics. Here's what we do in the center of town versus some of the other areas.
He might also want to be aware of what's, I just heard it on the news,
Sure.
it's the first time I've heard it, but
Sure.
there is concern now.
Okay.
So, conservation and development, it's a difficult area because we're into the CDBG realm. And I did do some thinking about the question that we talked about last night, with the question of the special town meeting warrant article. But before I jump into that, one thing that I thought about is that in the chart we have staff person who in planning who's supported 75% by the grant. I think it's the community development planner.
So we're
I thought I read that within the language later in the book, that if I'm wrong, that's
Page
good.
91. It's on page 91.
It's on page 91.
Page 84 has an org chart on it.
I think what they're referring to on page 91 is Nate Award.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, do we have, we're confident that we'll get, are we gonna still fund that from the grant and that's just a high priority from whatever comes from the grant?
The grant balances that staff have presented reflect that there are sufficient funds between the expected minimum grant of at least $450,000 next year and carryover balances from prior year grants to fully fund the administrative share through FY14. So I'm not facing a gap on that in 14 for the admin portion. Plus there's a lot of grants left, administration left to do.
And I think it's important to keep in mind that under the CDBG rules, they have rules for what portion of the grant can be used for administration, what can be used for social services, what can be used for capital, and you can't.
Use one for the other.
Right.
Right.
And that formula will apply to the lesser amount.
Yes.
Yes.
So on this page where you say, on this page 91, where you say that there are 3.8 positions, is that, does it include all the grant funded people, or is that just non-grant funded? I wasn't very clear. Are there more than that number in the department, or is that it?
It's planning.
Planning on page 91 or
In the chart.
91? In that chart?
I believe that's what's funded by the general fund, but I'm getting all choked up.
Sorry.
I'll have to confirm that.
Yeah.
I didn't bring it down my big notebook with all, that has that detail in it.
Looks
Well,
like it's
we'll
all
be
there
back.
in planning.
We're back to this
We'll be
when we
back.
get to the departmental budget. To some extent, things that we talk about today, if they're not answerable, they're really just keys of what we probably want to talk about yet again when we get to the more detailed departmental budget, and just things that are more, that we need, probably want to talk about a little bit more of the policy kinds of things. I think that it's important to know that we are required to spend the money and to have that be able to say that with absolute certainty for administration, because there are various ways that some of our town meeting members might want to inquire, and one of which is if we have to reduce community development expenses, should we not look at our staffing if we're to reduce in order to protect something else in community development?
Right, if you don't spend it on the staff, you give it back to the federal government.
So that's, I was thinking about the discussion that we had last night about the question of putting something on the warrant as an additional article. Had you thought about the wording of that? You didn't really.
No. No, I haven't. I think the main point I wanted to make last night, and I'll reinforce, is given the uncertainties about how much CDBG funding we will get, even though I've been reassured that it is very, very likely we will receive at least $450,000 or half the amount. I wanted to reassure people in the community that my recommendation on social services funding is there will be some supplemental funds appropriated to level fund those to the extent that they weren't fully covered by the grant in its current levels. And so the mechanism of how we do that, you know, there's plenty of time to talk about the best or, you know, preferred way to do that. Special article being one such way.
Yeah, I mean, there is some merit to the special. The more I thought about it after the meeting, the more I thought that there really is some merit to it, because it allows us to talk about the policy behind doing it, as opposed to just putting it within the budget, which doesn't then focus the discussion on the policy. And the policy question I was thinking about is that if we do this, so the way the budget is constructed, it would seem there would be an additional expense that would not have a known revenue source, and would at that point likely come from free cash. And if it came from free cash, and that's sort of half a question, would it be coming from free cash? And if it did, then we're back into sort of an issue that this committee has talked about before, which is that we don't want to use free cash for ongoing year-to-year expenses, but want to use it only for things that we know have an exceptional need on a one-time basis, or are segues to known new revenues or known more orderly savings into the future. So, you know, if we're doing it by a special article, I think that was part of my reaction last night, was probably thinking, oh gosh, this is a free cash thing. Was I wrong?
I think it's too early to know the answer to that. Frankly, I think we've got a long way to go before we know what our revenues are probably going to look like. Next week, the governor is going to tell us a lot of things that are going to help clear this stuff up. So it could be free cash, it could be stabilization, it could be FY14 estimated revenue. We don't know yet.
Whereas free cash or stabilization still is reserves.
That's true.
Well, I portrayed this not as a permanent suggested way to fund these things, but it's very much a transition year or a longer term, you know, policy and funding mechanism is figured out. Coupled with the uncertainty, especially this coming year, what sort of grant money we're going to get in the first place, which is the preferred funding for all of it.
Which is why I was beginning to sort of rethink my position, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just to remind us that when we first started funding social service agencies, there was a separate article for several years. And I don't know what the funding source was, we have to go back and look, couldn't find it in finance committee reports. That's the way we did it for several years, we didn't.
Do you remember the history? Because I don't really remember how long ago that was.
It was in the days of a lot of state aid.
Yeah, the
It
change
has to
into
get back.
the change to have it go into community services functional area. I'm thinking it's 2006, 2007 timeframe.
So prior to that, it was a separate article.
Yeah.
For about 10 years, like since mid 90s or.
No.
Since it started, I mean, since, it was.
Well, maybe it was.
It was in the nineties.
Yeah.
Nice.
Were you on,
Yeah,
James, what do you think?
I remember it being a separate article too, and there was a committee that, went through a bunch of different, nonprofits. They had a list of, I guess people,
Like they still do.
I guess the nonprofits, gave requests to this committee, and they went through and they picked out which and how much to give to each organization. Not everybody who asked got it, but, I guess they prioritized them right. I never went to those meetings, they were on that committee. But I do remember them having a committee and, approaching it that way. I'll look at my old finance committee books and see if I can find anything.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly came in the era of when there was a big slope up in state aid. And all of a sudden, we said, well, this would be a good thing to do.
Yeah, I've never done it before.
And other cities and towns were doing it more frequently at that time, supporting human service agencies. Yeah, clearly.
But then we put it into the budget.
This is a,
It was in the budget, and then we took it out when Schaefer was here.
Oh, we'll have to see.
And took it out and put it into a grant, because people at town meeting were not happy with that.
let me be clear.
Okay.
I believe very strongly that these are fundamentally important investments for government to make. The policy question is for equity and good public policy. What's the most logical funding source for investments like this? And investing to provide basic needs and other support, benefiting primarily low and moderate income people, I think should be a fundamental role of the federal government that collects tax revenue from the broadest array of sources. And conversely, I don't think long-term that local property tax, a more regressive type of tax, is the best method to fund these types of things. That's different than saying they're not worthy. I think the important thing is what services are provided to the people who need them. So I don't, from my own perspective, I don't get as hung up about whether it's a property tax appropriation, but whether or not the services are being provided. And this comes back to what's the proper role of state, local, and federal governments to do it.
Because I think my point was when we took it out of the town government, put it on grants, it was a tough time, but we had said the very things you said.
Yeah.
And if the grant funding runs out, we're going to continue to support this.
That's right.
So I think that's important.
That's right.
That may be the most interesting political philosophy statement I've heard since being involved in town government for the last dozen years. And I'm wondering if there's a way to inject that into the discussion in town meeting, only in that the prejudice always seems as though it's good versus evil, that human services, cutting the human services budget is only done by bad people. and increasing it is only done by good people. And to reshape that discussion slightly by expounding upon that idea, I think would go a long way toward reshaping, making those discussions more cooperative and less hostile.
Yeah, maybe the other thing is that I always frame it as, because I find it very troubling too, I think that they are important services that are provided, but you know, if it comes at the expense of a part of a police officer who responds to a domestic violence call, or it comes at the expense of a somebody in the schools who works with a reduced fee eligible lunch child, you know, you're also talking about valuable human services that the town is providing through other mechanisms, and that it's a question then that we have to rely on our town manager, and in conjunction with his consultations with the superintendent and library director, and through our various processes to set priorities for us. It's not that we think that they're not important expenses, but we've also thought that everything else we invest in is important.
So just to elaborate and to your point, it's not that it changes the outcome in the end, but it just contextually changes the nature of the discussion. That very important services, and given wherewithal, you know, higher state aid, etc., would certainly find a way to funnel those services in to make a stronger community. Alternatively, the better way to fund these philosophically, politically, would be on a broader federal level as opposed to a local level. And that's just an interesting
You
thing.
can make the same policy pronouncement on things like affordable housing. It's great that we have the Community Preservation Act, which is a very small local property surcharge. That in and of itself is not sufficient to do all that needs to be done for creating affordable units or preserving the ones that we have. And you know, it goes back to the federal tax debate as well. It's the role of the federal government, and there's a big divide in this country. What the role should be.
I think Bob is right. I think there will be a lively debate about this in the town meeting. Chances are.
You mean in terms of opposing it? I don't see that happening. In fact, people want to add to that generally. I mean, they cap it at whatever you set it at, but I don't get the sense that there's much opposition to community services. I think there is support for that.
Well, I mean, there was a motion last year to amend the budget, and there was a separate article that I think was dismissed, if I recall, but there was substantial debate and discussion on the motion to amend.
To add money.
To add money, and
That we said we didn't want them to add money, though.
That's right, and so money was not added, but we had the community development block grant that year. So I think that, you know, it's sort of hard to read into all of that discussion what would have happened if the community development block grant had not been available. And I think this is, as you say, it's going to be a lively and important discussion the town meeting is going to have. In the end, it could come down to a question of choices of where this is versus reserves, where this is versus other expenses the town might be considering as valid, and it's important on its own. And it's a question of how to best structure it, and the warrant article is a way to structure it, and
I presented a level services overall budget recommendation, and I'm suggesting that for social services that we have a plan to present level services, level funding in that regard.
And I guess the last thing I'll say.
Ideally with a federal grant, but failing that,
Yeah.
some
Right,
supplement
yeah.
locally.
And just as one last follow-up, and then I recognize the if, you know, when we get to this discussion at the budget coordinating group, then we get to the questions of, well, what does that say for the library director and the superintendent, the trustees and the school committees, as they are facing falling grants for programs that they think are vital, and do they then feel that they also should have the ability to do that? I think that this discussion as to what's appropriate that we're having right now probably does have to come back to the budget coordinating group as a matter of fairness to all of the segments that are funded through the general fund. Anurag?
Well, I was just kind of curious, you mentioned that this is a transition period because of the grant issues. Could you specify a little bit more on that, like transition, what does that mean?
Well, our status has changed. We're now being encouraged to apply in a competitive grant. So, you know, that could be the rules that we play by over the next couple of years, although those will be up for review again in the next 18 months by the state. So this is a, you know, transition, interim, it's an interim like in-between period to a longer term funding.
So is there a policy statement that to the extent that we get the grants, they're going to be used to fund these services? When we don't get the grants, the town is going to fill in.
That could be one way to do it.
Okay, I'm just kind of curious about if that's really your intent.
That's my intent clearly for FY14.
Sure.
Yeah.
Then I think that's an important statement to make to the BCG, because that doesn't say this is an ongoing way, that we'll come up with articles every time, you know, you're
Right.
the budget. Because I hear what you're saying, Andy, but I'm not so sure that the same rationale can be given for schools and library. So I think we want to be very careful that we're not encouraging the other two units to come in with articles to supplement anything that they have over our guidelines.
No, but I assume that if it's discussed at the budget coordinating group and they have grants that they're losing and have similar arguments to make, that they will make them. And we don't have to think what they are if we're not discussing their budgets tonight.
Right.
Anything else that you want to talk about under conservation, development, planning, inspections? Yes.
Actually, it's inspection services that,
Yeah.
the return of the inspector, the electrical inspector, we've kind of gone back and forth over the last few years, maybe the last several years, not immediately. We had an electrical inspector, then we went to doing inspections via contract basis.
Right.
Now we're heading back to the hired employee. Is there, and I'm not saying one is right or wrong, you know, circumstances are different, I'm just kind of trying to understand the context a little bit of what makes now the right time to sort of put an inspector back in play. Are we thinking the volume is a little higher, or is it really the coordinating of that effort with the other staff that do inspection makes it just make a whole lot more sense? And it's really ultimately less expensive to have somebody on staff, or at least a break even and better service.
There's a very small net cost of making this change, like just a few $1,000s, I think, net, because we're spending this money now on this contract employee. And I think one of the more interesting budget hearings, if I can be so bold as to predict, will be to hear from Rob Mora, our building commissioner. He can really lay out philosophically kind of the strategic direction he's taking the inspection services function, reorganizing basic work days so that there's more face time with each other at set times of the day, and then there's periods of the day where all the inspectors are out kind of more geographic based, so it's more efficient. There's less going from appointment to appointment all over town, so getting more done per shift and all that. And then having an electrical inspector who's a regular staff person will increase that coordination with the other inspection team members and with the applicants themselves by being more readily available to issue permits and be responsive to requests and all that stuff. But Rob Moore has been living and breathing this stuff, and he has a lot of good thoughts on how he sees the potential benefits. I would encourage you to ask away when he comes in to see you.
Yeah, I think you'll get a thoughtful,
Yeah.
experienced perspective from Rob, and he's really coming in and taking charge in that department. And I think that, as much as anything, I can do with the time.
Yeah, and another question that I will reserve for that night is I was curious as to whether there are concerns about the quality of inspections that are done by a part-time person, whether there's a concern about getting more uniform or higher quality inspections, or if that's not a factor, but that's a question to be reserved for the expert who is here. Anything else in the community's development, so in terms of community services? Anything in community services?
Can I ask a quick question? I just, out of curiosity, on page 95, and I don't really understand this, I'm asking this more out of, wanted to understand, so there are line items for appropriations for public health, senior center, community development, and so on. And then there are sources of funds. Is there any matching for the top half or the bottom half, or are they kind of the funds go into the pool, and these 7 areas come and kind of draw from that pool? Is that how it works, or?
The department, so the extent to
Like-
which, for
like-
example, there are license and permit revenues
Yeah,
listed as a source below,
yeah.
it's because those are licenses and permits that are generated by the departments above.
Across the departments, not just any one. So I was curious about, like, if there was a way to know, like the senior center, for example. I'm just any of these, like public health or community development. If there's any way to know how much funds they are
Each item.
consuming,
Page 102.
if on page 102.
Well, that's who it's
Senior
for.
center.
Does it
Right.
tell all of them?
Must be for each of those.
There was a breakdown, sometimes in more detail, on the departmental level budget summaries. So public health, for example, on page 98, you'll see public health related sources of funds that are included in that community services category on page 95 for the whole functional area. But
So
those are the health related ones on page 98.
251. 251. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but even if that's another drop off.
Anything else,
Fine.
community
good.
services? Other than it's great to have the pool back yet again,
Yes, it is.
there's a whole year of it. Don't have to worry about a part year.
That's right.
There's general feeling that we're gonna get from when we talk to Linda and Barbara that it was a success.
Oh, it was very much a success, and the fact that there'll be some certainty about when it's opening this
The pool.
summer, toward, right when school gets out. And we have the experiences from our first full summer. they'll be explaining how they try to use that experience to try to increase the number of people who come down and enjoy the pool. That's why we did all this. And through the JC